December 7, 1943. Lieutenant James "Red" Matheson felt the sudden jolt before he heard the sound, a metallic ping that seemed impossibly small against the roar of his Merlin engine. His P-51B Mustang, christened Kentucky Belle, had just taken ground fire over occupied France, a single round from a German rifle that should have been nothing more than a nuisance. Fighter pilots expected flak. They expected cannon fire from Messerschmitts. They even expected the occasional lucky shot from a determined infantryman. What they did not expect was for their aircraft, the vaunted champion of the skies, the fighter that would win the war, to begin dying from such a trivial wound. The coolant temperature gauge began climbing almost immediately. Matheson watched with growing dread as the needle swept past the red line. Within 90 seconds, white vapor began streaming from beneath his cowling. His throat tightened. Every pilot in the European theater knew what came next. The liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that magnificent piece of British engineering that gave the Mustang its speed and altitude performance, was about to cook itself to death. He had perhaps 3 minutes before seizure, perhaps 5 if God smiled upon him. The French countryside below offered no friendly airfields, only occupied territory and a long walk to a prisoner of war camp, if the Gestapo didn't find him first. This scene played out hundreds of times across the war-torn skies of Europe and the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, and it stemmed from a design decision that seemed entirely reasonable on the drafting tables of North American aviation in California. The P-51 Mustang represented the pinnacle of fighter design, combining American airframe engineering with British power plant technology. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It could outmaneuver almost anything the Luftwaffe threw at it. It could reach speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Yet this thoroughbred of the air possessed an Achilles heel so fundamental, so potentially catastrophic, that a single rifle-caliber bullet in the wrong place could transform the war's most advanced fighter into a gliding coffin. The vulnerability lay in the cooling system. Unlike the rugged air-cooled radial engines that powered the P-47 Thunderbolt or the earlier P-40 Warhawk, the Mustang's Merlin engine required liquid coolant, a mixture of water and ethylene glycol, circulated through a complex network of pipes, radiators, and passages to prevent the 12-cylinder engine from literally melting under its own power. This system, elegant in its efficiency, depended entirely on maintaining pressure and fluid volume. A puncture anywhere in the coolant lines, the radiator matrix positioned vulnerably beneath the fuselage, or the header tank mounted just behind the propeller, would drain the system within minutes. Without coolant, the aluminum cylinder heads would warp, pistons would seize, and the engine would destroy itself with mechanical violence. According to research preserved in the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency archives, this vulnerability accounted for a disproportionate number of P-51 losses, not from enemy fighters engaging in honorable aerial combat, but from ground fire, from spent shell casings tumbling through the air during bomber formations, even from debris kicked up during low-level strafing runs. The very feature that made the Mustang supreme, its streamlined, liquid-cooled engine, also made it desperately fragile. The story of this fatal flaw begins not in combat, but in the peaceful California sunshine of 1940. North American Aviation received a contract from the British Purchasing Commission to design a new fighter aircraft. Britain, standing alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France, desperately needed modern fighters to replace losses in the Battle of Britain. The company's chief engineer, Edgar Schmood, assembled a team that included aerodynamicist Ed Horkey and project engineer Raymond Rice. They had an audacious goal: design and build a prototype in just 120 days. Schmood, a German immigrant who had fled Europe in 1930, brought with him an intimate understanding of advanced aerodynamics. He envisioned an aircraft with laminar flow wings, a revolutionary design that would slip through the air with minimal drag. To maximize performance, every decision prioritized speed and range. The team selected the Allison V1710 engine initially, a liquid-cooled power plant that offered excellent high-altitude performance and a slim frontal profile. This choice allowed for the Mustang's distinctively sleek nose and streamlined fuselage, dramatically reducing drag compared to the blunt-nosed radial engine fighters then in service. The prototype, designated NA-73, rolled out in September 1940, an astonishing 102 days after the contract signing. Test pilot Vance Breese took it aloft on October 26, 1940, and immediately recognized they had created something special. The aircraft handled beautifully, with light, responsive controls and impressive speed. Early testing revealed performance that exceeded the specifications. Top speeds approaching 400 miles per hour at altitude, excellent range, and surprisingly good low-speed handling. But the British, while impressed with the airframe, quickly identified problems with the Allison engine. It performed poorly above 15,000 feet, exactly where bomber escort missions would be fought over Europe. The early Mustangs, designated Mark I by the Royal Air Force, were relegated to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack roles. The aircraft's true potential remained locked behind inadequate engine performance. This changed when Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang Mark I in April 1942 at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, England. Harker immediately recognized that marrying the Mustang airframe to the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, the supercharged power plant then powering the Spitfire Mark IX, would create an exceptional high-altitude fighter. His report to Rolls-Royce sparked a development program that would transform the Mustang from a promising design into the war's premier long-range escort fighter. As documented in the official history compiled by the Royal Air Force Museum, the Merlin-powered Mustang first flew in October 1942, and the results exceeded even optimistic predictions. The P-51B, as the American production version was designated, could reach altitudes above 40,000 feet, cruise at speeds that left most Luftwaffe fighters struggling to catch up, and, most importantly, carry enough fuel to escort bombers from England to targets deep inside Germany and return. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, recognized the Mustang as the solution to the devastating losses suffered by unescorted bomber formations over Europe. Production ramped up dramatically. By mid-1943, P-51s began reaching operational squadrons in England. Yet with each aircraft delivered, North American aviation and the Army Air Forces delivered that same critical vulnerability. The cooling system remained exposed, fragile, and utterly essential to engine survival. March 6, 1944. The 8th Air Force launched its first major bomber raid on Berlin, and Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group flew escort in his P-51B Shangri-La. The mission would demonstrate both the Mustang's strategic importance and its deadly vulnerability. Over 300 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators droned toward the German capital, protected by a swarm of P-51s, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in force. More than 150 German fighters scrambled to defend the Reich. Gentile, already an ace with multiple victories, dove into a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s attacking the bomber stream. The ensuing dogfight scattered across 50 miles of sky. Fighters twisted and turned, cannon shells and machine gun tracers crisscrossing the frozen air at 25,000 feet. Gentile destroyed 2 FW-190s in quick succession, his 650 caliber machine guns proving devastatingly effective. But during a climbing turn to engage a third German fighter, his wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, radioed a warning: "Lead your streaming white. Coolant." Gentile's heart sank. He hadn't felt any hits, hadn't heard the telltale thunk of cannon shells striking his aircraft, but somewhere in the chaos of combat, something, perhaps a 20-millimeter shell fragment, perhaps a stray round from another aircraft's guns, had punctured his cooling system. The temperature gauge climbed steadily. He had perhaps 10 minutes of engine life remaining, and he was deep over enemy territory with 300 miles of hostile landscape between his position and the English Channel. He made the only decision possible: run for home at maximum continuous power, trading the engine's remaining life for distance. His Merlin roared at war emergency power, consuming the dwindling coolant as cylinder head temperatures soared into the danger zone. Godfrey tucked in close, prepared to escort his leader as far as possible. The minutes crawled past. Gentile nursed every mile from his dying engine, watching the temperature gauge with the intensity of a man watching a burning fuse approach dynamite. The engine seized over Holland. One moment, The Merlin's powerful roar filled his cockpit. The next, a terrible grinding noise and sudden silence, except for the wind howling past the canopy. Gentile had no choice but to bail out. He would spend the next 6 weeks evading capture, aided by the Dutch resistance before finally reaching Allied lines. One of the lucky ones. According to records maintained at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, hundreds of other pilots were not as fortunate. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group encountered the vulnerability's most terrifying variant during a low-level strafing mission against a German airfield near Hanover on April 8, 1944. Johnson, flying a P-47 Thunderbolt, watched in horror as his wingman's P-51 took ground fire while pulling up from a strafing pass. A stream of white vapor erupted from beneath the Mustang's nose. The pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Green, attempted to gain altitude for a bailout, but the engine seized before he reached a safe ejection height. Green's aircraft nosed over and plowed into a forest at 300 miles per hour. There was no parachute, no survivor. A single tracer round from a German anti-aircraft gun, probably 20 millimeter or smaller, had ended everything. Lieutenant Colonel John Landers commanded the 38th Fighter Squadron, stationed at Leiston in England, during the critical months of spring 1944. In his personal diary, portions of which were later published in the squadron history, Landers recorded his growing concern about the coolant system vulnerability. "Lost Anderson today," he wrote on March 22, 1944. "Ground fire over Frankfurt. Saw him take one hit, maybe two. Hard to tell in combat. Started streaming glycol immediately. He radioed that temps were climbing fast. Made it to the Rhine before the mill seized. Crashed attempting a dead-stick landing in a field. Aircraft exploded on impact. They're pulling bodies out of these ships too often, and it's not always German fighters doing the killing." The pilots developed grim humor about their vulnerability. They called the belly-mounted coolant radiator the built-in can opener, referencing how easily ground fire could puncture it. Some pilots, in direct violation of regulations, attempted to armor the radiator area with scrounged steel plates, but the added weight affected performance and handling. The unofficial modifications were eventually banned by group commanders after several near accidents during takeoff with overloaded aircraft. The Army Air Force's engineering staff recognized the problem but faced an impossible dilemma. Any significant redesign would interrupt production at a time when every fighter was desperately needed. Flight Officer Charles "Chuck" Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier, flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group and experienced the vulnerability firsthand during a mission over France on March 5, 1944. During a dogfight with a Messerschmitt Bf-109, Yeager's aircraft took hits from the German fighter's nose-mounted cannon. One shell passed through the coolant header tank. The temperature gauge went crazy, Yeager later recounted in debriefing reports preserved in combat archives. "I knew I had maybe 3 minutes before that Merlin ate itself. I was over enemy territory with a dying airplane and no good options." Yeager managed to coax his wounded Mustang toward the Pyrenees Mountains and the Spanish border. As the engine temperature reached critical levels, he aimed for a small clearing and performed a wheels-up landing. He survived the crash, evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, and eventually returned to England. But his P-51 became just another statistic in the growing tally of aircraft lost to cooling system failure. His experience highlighted a bitter irony. Pilots who survived direct combat with German fighters were being shot down by comparatively minor ground fire that would barely have inconvenienced a P-47 pilot. The contrast between the P-51 and P-47 became a source of constant debate among fighter pilots. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 air-cooled radial engine, could absorb tremendous battle damage. Pilots returned to base with cylinders shot away, oil lines severed, and cowling panels missing. The big radial simply kept running. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group famously returned to base after an encounter with German fighters that left his P-47 with more than 200 holes from cannon and machine gun fire. The engine never faltered. Such resilience was impossible with the liquid-cooled Merlin. Yet despite its vulnerability, the P-51 possessed capabilities the P-47 could not match. Its range meant bombers could penetrate deep into Germany with continuous fighter protection. Its speed and altitude performance allowed it to engage German fighters on favorable terms, and its relatively low cost and production efficiency meant that losses could be replaced quickly. The strategic calculus was brutal, but inescapable. The Mustang's virtues outweighed its fatal flaw, and pilots would simply have to accept the risk. By mid-1944, North American aviation's engineers had accumulated enough combat loss data to recognize patterns. Internal company memos from June 1944, later declassified and available through the National Archives, reveal mounting pressure to address the cooling system vulnerability. Chief Engineer Edgar Schmood convened his design team to explore solutions, but they faced severe constraints. Any major redesign would require halting or slowing production, unacceptable when combat squadrons were consuming aircraft as fast as factories could build them. The engineering team considered several approaches. One proposal involved relocating the main coolant radiator from its vulnerable ventral position to wing-mounted installations, similar to the arrangement used on some German fighters. Wind tunnel testing showed this would increase drag significantly and reduce top speed by approximately 15 miles per hour, a potentially fatal disadvantage in combat. Another proposal suggested adding redundant coolant lines and a reserve coolant tank, but calculations showed this would add nearly 200 pounds of weight, again degrading performance unacceptably. A more practical solution emerged: improving armor protection around critical cooling system components. The P-51D model, which entered production in early 1944, incorporated several modifications based on combat experience. Engineers added armored shrouds around the coolant header tank behind the propeller, increased armor thickness around the belly radiator, and redesigned coolant lines to include some redundancy. These changes reduced vulnerability somewhat, but could not eliminate it entirely. Physics imposed absolute limits. The cooling system required radiators with thin metal fins to dissipate heat efficiently. Heavy armor would defeat the entire purpose of the design. The P-51D also introduced a bubble canopy that dramatically improved pilot visibility, a change that helped pilots spot threats earlier and potentially avoid ground fire. Combat reports suggested the improved visibility saved lives, though quantifying this benefit proved difficult. What was measurable was the continued loss rate from coolant system damage. Even with improvements, P-51Ds remained vulnerable to the same fundamental problem. A single lucky shot could still doom the aircraft. Test pilot Bob Chilton, working for North American Aviation at the company's Los Angeles facility, flew experimental P-51s fitted with various protective modifications throughout 1944. In a report dated September 15, 1944, he noted, "Armor additions provide marginal improvement against small arms fire, but remain inadequate against 20mm or larger cannon shells. The fundamental problem persists. Liquid cooling requires components that cannot be adequately armored without destroying the performance advantages that make the Mustang valuable in the first place. We are attempting to armor a system that by its nature resists armor." Meanwhile, in the European theater, maintenance crews developed their own unofficial solutions. Ground crews at some bases fabricated wire mesh guards to protect coolant lines from debris during ground operations. Others experimented with self-sealing coolant lines similar to self-sealing fuel tanks, but the pressures and temperatures involved made this approach impractical. The cooling system operated at much higher pressures than fuel systems, and the self-sealing compounds then available could not function reliably under those conditions. An interesting alternative emerged from the British, who had been operating Mustangs longer than the Americans. Royal Air Force engineering teams experimented with coolant additives designed to raise the boiling point and reduce evaporation rates, potentially giving pilots an extra minute or two of operation after a coolant system hit. The spring of 1944 marked the apex of the air war over Europe. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, was approaching, and the Allies needed absolute air superiority. The 8th Air Force and 9th Air Force flew maximum effort missions almost daily, and P-51 Mustangs bore much of the burden. The aircraft's long range made it indispensable for escort missions, but this same range requirement meant pilots often operated hundreds of miles from friendly territory, making any mechanical failure potentially fatal. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group became the top Mustang ace in the European theater, with more than 26 aerial victories. His skill and aggression made him a legend among 8th Air Force pilots. But even Preddy understood the Mustang's Achilles heel. In a letter to his brother William, also a P-51 pilot, dated May 10, 1944, George wrote, "The bird flies like a dream and fights like a champion, but she's got a glass jaw. Take one good hit in the cooling system and you're looking at bailout or crash landing. I've lost 3 wingmen that way since February, not to German fighters, but to their engine seizing after ground fire. It's the cruelest way to lose a man, watching his mill cook itself while he's still got the enemy behind him." The statistical reality was sobering. Analysis conducted by the Army Air Force's Operational Analysis Section in late 1944 examined loss causes for P-51s in the European theater between January and October 1944. The study, documented in military archives, found that approximately 18% of all P-51 combat losses resulted directly from cooling system failure following battle damage, a proportion significantly higher than for other failure modes. When compared to the P-47 Thunderbolt operating in similar roles, the disparity was stark. Cooling system losses for the air-cooled P-47 were effectively zero, yet the same analysis revealed why the Army Air Forces continued accepting the vulnerability. The P-51's superior range meant it could escort bombers throughout their entire mission, dramatically reducing bomber losses to German fighters. The strategic calculation was brutal: lose more fighters to save more bombers, and ultimately, lose fewer total aircraft and airmen. Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, acknowledged this calculus in a staff meeting recorded in official minutes from July 1944. The Mustang's cooling system vulnerability is a known deficiency, but its operational advantages are so substantial that we have no practical alternative. We are training pilots to minimize exposure to ground fire and maximize survival chances after cooling system damage. Some missions became particularly notorious for the cooling system vulnerability. Low-level strafing attacks against German airfields and transportation targets put P-51s directly into intense anti-aircraft fire. Pilots had to fly low and slow to accurately engage ground targets, making them vulnerable to even small arms fire. A 1944 tactical analysis noted that P-51 losses during ground attack missions were 40% higher than during air-to-air combat missions, with cooling system damage being the leading cause. Lieutenant William Cullerton of the 4th Fighter Group participated in a large-scale strafing mission against German airfields on April 11, 1944. His post-mission report described watching 3 P-51s from his squadron take ground fire during attacks on parked Luftwaffe aircraft. All 3 began streaming coolant vapor. 2 pilots managed to climb to sufficient altitude to bail out successfully. The third, Lieutenant Michael Quirk, attempted to nurse his damaged fighter back toward Allied lines but crashed when his engine seized over Belgium. Quirk survived the crash but was captured and spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. While the European theater received most P-51 deployments initially, the aircraft also served extensively in the Pacific theater against Japanese forces. Here, the cooling system vulnerability presented different challenges. The vast distances of the Pacific meant emergency landing options were even scarcer than over Europe. A pilot with a failing cooling system over the Pacific faced either ditching in the ocean or attempting to reach a friendly base potentially hundreds of miles away, usually an impossible task with a dying engine. The 7th Air Force began receiving P-51Ds in late 1944 for operations from bases in the Marianas Islands against targets in Japan. Major Robert Moore commanded a P-51 squadron operating from Iwo Jima, the volcanic island captured in February and March 1945 after brutal fighting. From Iwo Jima, P-51s could escort B-29 Superfortress bombers all the way to Tokyo and back, missions covering more than 1,500 miles of mostly open ocean. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses differed from German defenses in important ways. The Japanese relied more heavily on smaller caliber automatic weapons, typically 20mm and 25mm cannons with high rates of fire. These weapons produced a dense curtain of fire that was less accurate than German 88mm flak, but covered larger areas. For P-51 pilots, this meant greater risk of taking multiple small hits rather than 1 or 2 heavy hits. Any of these small hits could puncture the cooling system, Captain Jerry Yellen flew P-51 Mustangs from Iwo Jima during the final months of the war against Japan. In his memoir, later published decades after the war, Yellen described a mission over Tokyo on May 29, 1945. "We were escorting B-29s at about 20,000 feet when Japanese fighters came up to intercept. During the dogfight, I saw one of our guys, Lieutenant Raymond Corzine, take hits from a Kawasaki Ki-61 fighter. His coolant system was breached. You could see the white vapor trail streaming back from his radiator. He radioed that his temperature was climbing fast. We were 300 miles from Iwo Jima, mostly over water. Corzine attempted to maintain altitude while heading back toward Iwo Jima, but his Merlin engine seized approximately 40 minutes later, still 200 miles from base. He ditched in the Pacific Ocean. Air-sea rescue forces launched immediately, but the search area was vast and the Pacific unforgiving. Corzine was never recovered. His loss exemplified the particular cruelty of the cooling system vulnerability in the Pacific theater. The aircraft itself might be salvageable after a ditching, but pilot survival in shark-infested waters far from rescue was unlikely. The 5th Air Force, operating P-51s from Philippine bases against Japanese targets, encountered similar problems during ground attack missions against Japanese shipping and installations. Major Thomas McGuire, who became one of America's highest-scoring aces, flew P-38 Lightnings rather than P-51s, partly because the twin-engine Lightning offered redundancy that the single-engine Mustang could not match. If one engine failed, a P-38 could limp home on the other. A P-51 with a seized Merlin had no such option. Japanese pilots, briefed on American aircraft vulnerabilities, specifically targeted the P-51's cooling system when possible. Captured Japanese documents from after the war, translated and archived by military intelligence, included tactical guidance for fighter pilots emphasizing the Mustang's susceptibility to radiator damage. One document dated March 1945 noted, "The American P-51 fighter is very fast and well-armed, but depends on liquid engine cooling. Concentrated fire against the lower fuselage and radiator area will often result in the American fighter being forced to withdraw from combat, even if not immediately shot down." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and the war against Japan ended on August 15, 1945. The P-51 Mustang's combat record was extraordinary. Allied pilots flying Mustangs destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat and inflicted devastating losses on ground targets. The aircraft enabled the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industry and oil production, arguably shortening the war. Yet the butcher's bill included hundreds of pilots lost to the cooling system vulnerability, men who might have survived had they been flying aircraft with air-cooled engines. Post-war analysis by the Army Air Forces revealed the full scope of the problem. Between January 1944 and August 1945, the 8th Air Force alone lost approximately 450 P-51s to cooling system failure following battle damage, roughly 8% of total P-51 losses in the theater. These numbers did not include aircraft that returned to base with cooling system damage, but were written off as unrepairable. Nor did they include pilots who were wounded or killed when their aircraft crashed following engine seizure from coolant loss. The experience influenced post-war fighter design significantly. When the United States Air Force began developing jet fighters in the late 1940s, engineers carefully considered the vulnerability lessons learned from the P-51. Early jets used turbojet engines that, while requiring cooling systems for oil and accessories, did not depend on liquid cooling to the same degree as piston engines. The catastrophic failure mode of a punctured coolant system became less of a concern. However, the vulnerability lesson was not entirely learned. Some later aircraft, including the F-105 Thunderchief of the Vietnam War era, again suffered significant losses due to cooling system damage. The surviving P-51 pilots carried memories of the vulnerability throughout their lives. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, who completed 116 combat missions in P-51s without being shot down, later reflected on the aircraft's greatest weakness. "We all knew one good hit in the wrong place could end your day immediately. You learned to respect that vulnerability. It made you more careful during strafing runs, more aware of ground fire. But you couldn't let fear paralyze you. We had a job to do. We just accepted that the Mustang, for all its greatness, could be killed by something as small as a rifle bullet if that bullet found the right spot. Edgar Schmood, the P-51's primary designer, addressed the cooling system issue in a 1953 technical paper published by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He acknowledged that the vulnerability represented a calculated compromise. We could have designed the aircraft with an air-cooled radial engine and eliminated the cooling system vulnerability entirely, but we would have sacrificed the performance advantages that made the P-51 strategically valuable. Engineering design is fundamentally about compromises, choosing which disadvantages you are willing to accept in exchange for critical advantages. The cooling system vulnerability was a known deficiency from the beginning, but it was the price of achieving the range and speed performance that the aircraft needed to fulfill its mission. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, displays several P-51 Mustangs, including aircraft with visible battle damage. One exhibit includes a P-51D with multiple bullet and shell fragment holes in the coolant radiator area, a stark reminder of how vulnerable this critical system was. The museum's educational materials note that this particular aircraft, flown by Captain Clyde East during a mission over Germany in March 1945, barely made it back to base before the engine seized from coolant loss. East's survival was attributed to skill and luck in equal measure. Today, aviation historians and engineers study the P-51's cooling system vulnerability as a classic case study in engineering trade-offs and operational risk acceptance. The aircraft's success, despite its fatal flaw, demonstrates how superior performance in critical areas can offset significant vulnerabilities, but also how those vulnerabilities exact a price measured in lives. The pilots who flew the Mustang into combat understood they were riding a thoroughbred with glass bones, and they accepted the risk because the mission demanded it. Their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of those who did not return, stands as testament to both the aircraft's greatness and its deadly imperfection. The P-51 Mustang remains one of history's most celebrated fighter aircraft, a symbol of Allied air power and American engineering prowess. Yet beneath the legend lies the sobering reality. Excellence in one dimension cannot eliminate vulnerability in another, and even the finest machines carry flaws that can prove fatal. The white vapor trail streaming from a damaged Mustang's radiator became an all-too-familiar sight in the skies over Europe and the Pacific, a visible marker of the thin line between triumph and tragedy that defined aerial warfare in the Second World War.